And I think we're on.
I believe we are. Well, Jane, Disembodied Voice, thanks for setting us up. I'm Jamie Clark. I'm from Oasis. I have with me Robin Wilton, who is erstwhile longtime inhabitor of the privacy and policy space, who has found perhaps the best possible home for himself with the Internet Society, where his reach is both global and infinite. So, finally, Robin, a place where you can live up to the to your interests after all these years of bombing around in industry and with other organizations. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here, Jamie.
We are missing a panelist today, and I want to extend apologies on behalf of Don Jutla, who is from St. Mary's University in Halifax and a wonderful privacy expert, also co-chair with Ann Kavukian of one of our Oasis TCs on privacy by design. But Dawn has, at the worst possible moment, acquired a horrific case of basically laryngitis. So if she were with us, she'd be waving, she'd be doing what she could with gestures, and she couldn't say a darn thing. So we're very sorry Dawn can't join us. Dawn, I hope you feel better soon, and we're going to reschedule something so we can take advantage of you as well and get your take on some of these things. Nevertheless, we shall soldier on. And so for the next 27 minutes or so, Rob and I are going to chat a bit about what we're doing within the privacy space, with standards, with policy, and with technology, with the hope, since Rob and I are both basically open standards guys, that we're doing some things right and that we're actually supplying some things that will be useful to privacy-enhancing goals. And we have, do we, no shortage now of privacy-enhancing goals. Lots of people are saying that they want that, but what do we have to offer? Do we have any, are we creating things in the standards world and in technology that will actually make it better, not worse? That's what we're going to spend a bit of time talking about. And let me start with a very broad one. How's our demand curve, Robin? We only create things when people want them, I hope. And if we create something, whether it's a tech or a standard or an open source widget, and nobody uses it, then nothing happens. So we only get to success if citizens want privacy and understand it and act on it, and if the governments and policymakers and entities act so as to effectively demand and seek and incentivize more privacy. How's the demand curve going? Are we any better than we were 10 years ago?
Yeah, 10 years ago, yeah, I think probably we are. If you look at the mainstream media these days, you'll be hard put to avoid Snowden-related stories, and even before those came out, you would have been hard put to avoid things like, for example, concerns expressed about social networking, about data mining, about the way in which consumers are profiled. So I think in general, the demand curve is creeping up in the sense that there is at least awareness, and there's a level of public conversation about this. I do think, and we'll probably come onto this later when we look at tools and habits and behaviors, I do think that the demand curve to a certain extent is artificially depressed, in the sense that users wanting to do something about this depends on users thinking that there is a problem to be fixed. And what I see, I think, in the consumer market particularly, is that there are a lot of commercial business models based on the assumption that it's in their interests to ensure that consumers remain underinformed. So, I mean, I've ranted, and you've probably heard me do it, lots of times before about the social network phenomenon. I don't think there is such a thing. I think there's social interaction and there's networked interaction, and they operate by different rules. And if you do one thinking that you're doing the other, you may find that you're caught out by the difference in the rules. What I mean particularly with the social online social services is that it's in their direct business interest to lull you into thinking that you are having a close conversation with your buddies and only your buddies. And so it's not in their interest to tell you that there is a third party in the room who is monitoring that conversation, collecting the data, and monetizing it. So to that extent, I think there is a direct commercial bias against people being allowed to make an informed decision on privacy terms. But that aside, that's a sort of ongoing commercial downwards pressure on the demand curve. But that aside, I think things like the Snowden revelations and evident concern about data mining, Internet of Things, data monetization, those things get into the public debate, and that's very healthy.
I'm sure you've seen Errol Balkin's videos for Indy, IND.IE, where he's building some tools and procedures, but he's also tried to create a very strong message about independent versus intermediated third-party social networks.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody was saying that 5 years
ago. No, although there were people who were observing that everything we do these days is mediated. And so, yes, the peer-to-peer model that Errol is espousing definitely has a role to play here, because if you only have mediated services and everything we do online is mediated through at least one third party, then that's a privacy concern. It's a confidentiality concern as well, and a dependency concern and a choice concern. So I'm delighted, because I think Errol's got a very good combination of technical and developer capabilities, with a very strong sense of how he wants to change the market. And this can't happen. User adoption can't happen on the scale that it needs to change the demand curve that you mentioned, unless you influence the shape of the market.
There's also some suggestion, I think, when you say artificial depression in the marketplace, that good disclosure and consequences for failure to disclose brings more information, and that with more information about where's my stuff really going, who retains it, what are the consequences of that. Basically, the more we do with that information improvement environment, the greater demand will become. I'm not saying this very well, but if people smarten up, they will want more in the way of privacy than they think they want today. Am I hearing that right?
Absolutely, yes. And this has its roots in something I've been looking at for a year or so, and will be doing my best to work on more this year, which is to look at how our privacy habits are formed. Because, and I'm sure we'll talk about tools and technology before the half hour's out, but it's very tempting to say, well, what privacy tools can we give people? But to give someone a privacy tool is to intervene at just one point in the decision cycle. There are many other points at which people do things that lead to eventual privacy outcomes, other than just did they put a plugin in their browser? And so I'm kind of interested in looking at the rest of that cycle, figuring out what other factors influence people's privacy decisions and over the long term their privacy habits, and then working out what things other than tools would actually influence that behavior positively. And as you say, if people are underinformed, then they're making decisions on the basis of partial or flawed information, and those decisions will probably have worse outcomes than if they had better information. So I think there's a disclosure thing here. The disclosure part is interesting as well, and it comes back to how we form habits. You and I have talked before about privacy and harm, and is harm a good metric for privacy? And by and large, it isn't really, because the harms that can result from bad privacy behavior are often so remote that you don't draw the connection as the data subject between the bad.
Or they don't have a large enough currency amount attached to them that they come to the attention of courts and policymakers. I mean, they may be grave, but since you can't put a pound sign on them, nobody takes it seriously.
Right. And eating one donut is not going to give you a coronary, but eventually one donut will. Or smoking a cigarette won't give you lung cancer. Well, I mean, there's a statistical chance.
So we're going to call this the last donut problem now, right?
Well, I'm calling it reaching for the privacy banana instead of the donut. But there you go. I'll have to put a positive cast on these things.
Well, let's go there for a bit. What are there any bananas that we should be paying attention to at the moment? Are there things out there? There's all sorts of technologies and behaviors that are that create new threats to privacy. But are there some hopeful methods and tools that might push us in the right direction? What do you got in the banana field?
In the banana field, there are. There are some useful tools. There are tools that increase transparency, that help you understand what is going on. So, for example, as browser plugins for Firefox, you can get one called Lightbeam. When you visit a site, Lightbeam will show you what other sites are connected to that by things like trackers, and it will graphically display that for you. That's a very powerful way of showing you that you're not just going to newspaper X, but every time you go there, you're leaving a trace with however many other third parties that you never otherwise encounter, and certainly weren't the place that you were visiting. So there are tools that can help with transparency. There are tools like Cert Patrol, which can help you understand what certificate-related traffic is happening. So you might be very keen on using HTTPS to make sure that your browsing sessions are encrypted. But you'd be amazed what certificate-related traffic happens in a browser other than the traffic needed to establish the session with the website that you were visiting. And every time I see the pop-ups from Cert Patrol, I see third parties who I wasn't trying to contact, who are leaving certificate-related objects in my browser, who are sending me things that the browser, if I weren't using Cert Patrol, would be agreeing to on my behalf without telling me. So again, another tool that increases transparency.
Boy, I wish we could get those down to cartoon sort of Crayola level, don't you? Because when if you can get that kind of information down to the sort of the level of the Mozilla project's privacy icons, basic stuff, red, green, red, yellow, green, then you're good. But you ask the average user to pay attention to what's going on in the certificates underneath their session, and
sure,
that's the bridge too far, I think.
Yeah. Well, not only paying attention to it, but also setting the defaults and managing your privacy settings and managing your preferences and how you set the expression of those preferences. And I think this introduces another really interesting technical option, and it's what I call agency. And now we all know that if you keep putting pop-ups in front of a user to say, do you approve this? Do you want to make this disclosure? Do you approve for this third party to release these attributes? They instantly get bored and start clicking through. And so you don't improve things net. But if you take an agency approach to it and you say, well, we don't want users to have to do that every time, but supposing there was a component either running in the browser or as a third party on the network in the cloud, say, supposing there was an element where the user could go and express their preferences, and then that agent would enforce them on their behalf. You've reduced the management burden on the user, but you've retained the ability for them to control disclosures that are made on their behalf. And there's somewhere they can go where there might be an audit trail, and there are knobs and buttons they can tweak when they feel the need to do so, but they don't have to do it every time inside the transaction. So even the point I made earlier about everything we do is mediated, that can have a good side to it, because the fact there's a mediated architecture means that you can also put a third-party element in there that acts on the user's behalf, that can be fitted into the transaction chain, as it were.
Okay, so when we talk about agency, we're talking about tools that help you express and then deploy your preferences across a variety of situations without necessarily having to fiddle with the controls every time.
Right, and it takes all those pop-ups away because you've dealt with it, you've set it. You can go and check it if you want to, but you don't get pestered every time, and then you don't get click fatigue.
As a bridge to talking about standards, let me mention something in the middle. You mentioned proper notice and giving of consent. That's really informed consent. Big principle in law. You haven't really consented to something unless you knew enough to give consent and knew what you were consenting to. And there's some work which I don't think is in open standards yet, but we certainly covered it on open notice and open consent and methods to more clearly structure. When I say that I'm giving consent to something, how should entities in a web exchange gather that consent? How can they do it in a structured way so that it's clear that it is informed consent and that there's a persistent set of values created so that it can be reused? I mean, that's good stuff, and we're just starting to see that structured.
Yep, and I think it's vital that should happen through the standards process. because the alternative is that you have to agree with every other party that you want to interact with what your consent expression means. And we saw that was bad enough with a handful of browser vendors trying to decide what do not track means, which is theoretically a binary value or at worst a three-way value. Don't track me, do track me, I haven't expressed an opinion. So that was bad enough getting that standardized. But I think you're absolutely right. It's vital to get things like expressions of consent standardized as far as possible, because otherwise you not only have to negotiate them with each other party, but you have to negotiate the format and the semantics as well.
Do not track, and do not track is now known as tracking preference expression over W3C, is a good example of an attempt within open standards to try and bring some concrete activities and shared structures to privacy interchanges. And what we have is users, browser users, attempting to indicate whether or not they wish their data to be shared in certain ways. And that that's been, I think the DNT standard's been out for about 3 years now, but it ran into limitations as well. How's it going with Do Not Track?
Well, that's a very good question. Yes, and as a user, it's pretty tough to tell, isn't it? Because if it's not working, what would be the symptoms? Well, I see some of those symptoms, but I'm not sure if they're arising because DNT isn't working or because of something else. So that comes back to the kind of the transparency and the fact that the information on which we're making our privacy decisions and setting our privacy habits, as it were, is partial and often flawed. And coming back to that habit forming thing, it's not surprising that when the bad consequences of poor privacy decisions are remote and difficult to associate with the bad thing that gave rise to them. What did I do that meant that I got this spam? That's really hard to tell. And that's not how it's not how people are wired to develop habits. They're wired to react to things like there's a tiger going to eat you, not that cigarette is going to kill you. And so we're trying to develop habits that are privacy respecting and privacy preserving, but without the sort of cues that make humans develop habits most effectively. And that's what I meant about the that decision cycle, which we should be influencing in other ways than simply providing some plugins and some persona management tools.
What's interesting about that is if you think about it, it puts potentially a heavy responsibility on standards projects, because what you're asked really, I infer that now we're having to tell them, well, not only do you have to create a clever widget, and a clever widget which is interoperable with a bunch of other things and so it will work, but also you should create a clever widget that is designed so as to fulfill needs that will induce people to rely on it and use it. It has to fit within the social context of users' patterns, which is, right. I mean, we ask people to declare security considerations and some other things, but I'm not sure we always do. I don't know if it's quite UX, but if we don't always necessarily conduct as much in open standards as we might to see whether the things we are creating are best ready for use and will be embraced by virtue of what, how they fit in with the use patterns of the people who they're being offered.
Sure, that's right, and obviously user experience is a huge part of it, because if how long is it since encrypted email has been around? I was looking at encrypted email products in the early to mid 90s, yeah, and yet their penetration in the mainstream market is negligible. So it's not that it can't be done technically. I have seen encrypted email products, and some of them have been okay, and some of them have had a pretty horrible user experience. But just like the browser toolkits, those are very late on in the decision-making cycle. By the time you've tried to implement PGP mail, you've already gone through 90% of the decision-making process. You've become aware that there's a problem, you've become motivated to find out more about it, you've done your research, you've identified some tools, you've decided to implement those tools on your laptop. You're a long way into the process by then. And there are so many other points in that decision-making cycle at which we could be influencing and educating people. But it requires different kinds of intervention. So if someone's not even conscious that there's a problem with privacy or tracking or beacons or third parties, they need a bit of information.
Well, let's go concrete on that. How's the encrypt all the things on the web business going? Because I know that ISOC, particularly Internet Society, is involved in that, and there's actually some activity going on, isn't there?
Yes, there is. Yeah. So this arose primarily out of the reaction at the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, at the first IETF plenary after the Snowden revelations, when they very clearly stood up and described pervasive monitoring as an attack on the internet. So that was their starting point. This is an attack. It doesn't matter who's doing it. This counts as an attack on the internet because it renders the infrastructure less trustworthy, less reliable. So if that's the position you start from, what's the rational thing to do about it? And one part of the rational response is to start to protect that infrastructure at whatever layer or layers you can protect it at. And so one of the rational responses is to start encrypting things at more than one layer of the internet. So you're leaving the way open for people to use HTTPS for their browser sessions. You're leaving it open for them to encrypt their email. Those things all happen pretty high up the internet protocol stack. But at the lower levels, there's an awful lot of information that flows through internet nodes that those nodes really do not need to see. So one way to protect against pervasive surveillance is to do what you can to ensure that the nodes at any particular internet layer, at any protocol layer, can only see the data that is appropriate to the functioning of that layer. So for instance, at the layer where DNS requests are served, you don't really need to know who someone is emailing because you're looking for a DNS server, you're looking to resolve a domain name. Yeah. So why not encrypt the data that is not relevant to the functioning of that layer? Then after you've gone through that layer and you pop up to the next one, the IP layer or wherever, there's another subset of the data that's being transmitted which is relevant to the functioning of that layer. So why not leave the rest encrypted, unzip the bit you need, use that, and off you go. So that's the sort of principle of what they're trying to do with encrypting at different layers of the internet. And it minimizes the data that is exposed to layers that don't really need to see it.
Well, that's sort of consistent, isn't it, with the general privacy practice of least necessary disclosure? You know, you're showing the bit that needs to be shown, and then everything else that's out there on the network. And it's not just governments here; it's anybody who wants to come sniff, read, mess with, alter, or tamper with your packets. You know, if they can't get at it, well, that's, you know, you're only showing the bit that is necessary. Is this well underway? I mean, are we going to see protocol change in HTTP2 and so forth fairly soon, or is this still sort of off in the woods?
There's work on it, but because you're looking at so many different layers of the stack, it's very hard to put a single timescale on them all. And you know, the rollout of HTTP2 is going to depend on many things other than whether or not we've incorporated crypto in it. So,
but it's fair to say it's actively being cooked.
Absolutely, yes. And I also think, to come back to your other point, you're right. This doesn't only protect against government pervasive monitoring. This protects against other ill-intentioned actors as well. But the point about government access is that the mere fact that you're encrypting things at more than one layer of the internet in no way means that law enforcement access under proper warrants is no longer possible. Of course it is. But you need to be more specific about which layer you want to intercept and what data you want, and you have to go to the appropriate owners or operators of that layer of the internet with the appropriate warrant. So this doesn't make things encryption doesn't make things impossible for law enforcement. It merely means that they have to go through due process, possibly at more layers than they have done up to now.
All right, moving on. So yes, it's happening. Keep an eye out for opportunistic encryption and the HTTP2 or HTTP project, and we're hoping to see. But it's a big big change. It rolls across a lot of things. It's going to take time for tools and protocols.
It is, and it makes sense because pervasive monitoring needs a pervasive response and protection. So a lot of standards, a lot of protocols, and a lot of deployments need to change in order for that to roll out across the whole stack.
Okay. Moving on, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Oasis is itself doing a number of projects which have fairly significant privacy impacts. One that's been out for several years is our Privacy Management Reference Model, or PMRM, PMRM, which offers actually a methodology. And this is not a data standard. It's loosely a business process standard for analyzing and identifying and then acting on trying to get from privacy policy, where you make a nice fatuous statement about what you will do, but getting it down into the implementation, so that you are in fact your machines, widgets, and processes are in fact implementing the things that you said you were going to do, or that you're required, for example, by law to do. And there's more law out there than there used to be, isn't there? We didn't have the European Data Protection Act within living memory, but now people are operating in an environment where they're going to get audited, and they're going to have requirements, and so giving them methodologies is probably a good thing. There's also quite a bit of work, and in fact, one of your colleagues, Steve Olshansky, is working with us on this in basically the identity management and access control space, like the Trust Elevation Project, to make sure that we're actually able to identify the parties to whom things go. There's a real strong connection between identity management on the one hand and privacy and getting things to the right place and no other place on the other hand. I'll mention just briefly, although I think we're going to do a different session on this when we have Dawn, that Oasis's Privacy by Design committee, which is basically about instructions for software engineers on how to do privacy by design, will have some impacts there. But particularly, let's talk about IDM for a second. I mean, there's a connection between all that. I mean, we're doing a lot of identity stuff, right? But we can't get privacy right unless we get that right. How are we doing on identity?
Yeah, absolutely. It's key, and not just in the sense of having to identify everyone and everything. It's actually just as important for privacy terms for people to be able to go online anonymously or pseudonymously, and for them to be able to separate different aspects of their life into what I call personas, which is that subset of things about you that's appropriate to a particular context. So there are things that you and I will chat about in this context, which would be completely inappropriate to other contexts, and vice versa. And I think we need in general to do a lot better job of helping people to express those different aspects of their life in different contexts, without all that information simply leaking into other contexts and being accessible to other third parties when the individual didn't intend for it to be there. So again, some of this could be technical in the sense of making provision for authentication based on pseudonyms or anonymous authentication. And some of it is to do with habits and user expectations, helping people separate the aspects of their life as appropriate to the context and disclosing data accordingly.
Speaking of, you're sitting in Europe as we speak. Speaking of things that ought not be there, how's right to be forgotten going?
Well, you know how I love that acronym. I think the desire to boil that down to a 4-letter soundbite has really harmed it in PR terms more than most other things. And actually, it's something much more rational than the critics of the acronym RTBF would have you think. For a start, this is about the enforcement of retention periods for personal data, and that has been in data protection legislation from the outset. It's just that up to now, it's pretty much ignored because it's up to the data controller to say what they think the appropriate retention period is. So that's one thing. There is a perfectly practical thing enshrined in law already about retention periods. The other one is that actually we're not insisting that people be forgotten, because that would be silly. You can't make someone forget you. But there are things in the public domain which are much easier to access now than they were before. And the presence of things like search engines and indexing has reduced a lot of friction that used to that used to apply even to data that was in the so-called public domain. Something could be in the public domain and yet be still pretty difficult to access. For example, in France, court records. Yes, they form a part of the public record, but interestingly, the publicly accessible record of a court case in France is not, like in the US and the UK, indexed on the name of the plaintiffs. So if you don't know who the plaintiff was, you have to get the authorization to go and look at that index instead of the publicly available index. Yeah. So there's stuff in the public domain that used to be hard to find, which, thanks to indexing and search engines, is now not hard to find and is accessible to a far greater public than it would otherwise have been and than may have been intended. So actually, the judgment against Google in Spain, with its finding that they should be required to de-index stuff, not to delete it from the web, but to de-index it, in my mind simply reintroduces a very healthy degree of friction that the prevalence and the scope and the reach of search engines and indexing had largely eroded.
So technology is forcing us to re-examine some of the ways we do what we do because it has so radically changed prior policy expectations. Good point. And we could talk about this all day. But out of compassion for people who are listening, we decided to give it to a half an hour, so I'll have to cut this one off. And Robin, maybe we can do this again because we want to get Don back here and talk about a number of the other very specific data structures and tools that are relevant to privacy and standards. And thank God that if I have to talk about privacy and standards, I get to lean on our friend Robin Wilton of the Internet Society, who knows about as much about that as anyone. Thanks so much for your time, Robin, and thanks for folks listening in, and we'll be doing this again on another topic in March.
Many thanks, Jamie. It's been a real pleasure as usual.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye now.